सब सुख दाता राम है, दूसर नाहि न कोय। सब सुख दाता राम है, दूसर नाहि न कोय। कहो नानक सुन रे मना, देह सिमरत गत होय।
Welcome back, everyone. So we are now moving on to our next panel, which is Guru Tegh Bahadur's Bani. So we do have a small schedule change due to Dr. Nikky-Guninder Kaur Singh's last minute commitment at the end of the day. Dr. Bashar Singh and her will be changing spots. So our first panelist for this panel will be Dr. Nikky Singh. Her paper is entitled "The Guru Tegh Bahadur Salok's Paradoxes, Poetic and Philosophical." Dr. Nikky-Guninder Kaur Singh is the Crawford Professor and Chair of Religious Studies at Colby College. Dr. Singh has published extensively in the field of Sikh studies. Her books include The First Sikh, Hymns of the Sikh Gurus, Of Sacred and Secular Desire, Lyrics from the Punjab, Sikhism and Introduction, Cosmic Symphony, the Early and Later Poems of Gurbeer Singh, Birth of the Khalsa, Feminine Principle and the Sikh Vision of the Transcendent, Physics and Metaphysics of the Guru Granth Sahib. She has served on the editorial boards of several journals, including History of Religions, the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, Sikh Formations, and Cross Currents. She's also the vice president of Alpha Beta Kappa chapter of Maine. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Nikky-Guninder Kaur Singh to give her presentation.
Thank you very much, Gurbeer. And thank you, Dr. Bashar Singh, for organizing this conference, for hosting it, and to Tegh Paul for doing your part here. It's really, really lovely to be in Maine and to be joining the Sangat across the globe on this very auspicious occasion. We celebrate Guru Tegh Bahadur's birthday, 400th birth centennial. Thank you for including me. I'm sorry for the last minute change. But and thank you also for the beautiful kirtan that we just heard, the first few shloks of Guru Tegh Bahadur. So as you noticed, as you mentioned, actually, Tegh, my topic is Guru Tegh Bahadur's paradoxes, philosophical and poetic. I want to focus on his poetry because that's what we have. That's what's the crux of his message for us, for his reception lies with the basic congregation, basic readers, basic listeners. So I want to focus on that. Altogether, we have his 59 Shabads, which are spread across the Guru Granth Sahib in 15 rags. These include Asa, Jai Javanti, of course, the last one, which are entirely composed of Guru Tegh Bahadur's verses. Then also in Sarang, Rag Sorat, Rag Gaudi, Rag Basant, and so forth. And then we have his Shaloks at the very end of the Guru Granth Sahib, just before the Mundavni, Guru Arjan's Mundavni, and those are 57. And we just heard on Kirtan about the first few Shaloks were sung very beautifully. Now, we've been hearing about the history, his biography. There's a lot done on it. And I just want to show my father's book, Guru Tegh Bahadur by Professor Harjeet Singh. And that's where he says that Guru Tegh Bahadur's poetry, his history, and his message are totally in coherence, a complete integration of the three dimensions. And I will just focus on the poetic aspect. As I want to repeat and this is the mode that was started by Guru Nanak himself. So the paradigm for the poetry is the founder Guru, his poetry, his message, his vision, his ideology, and his poetic metaphors and his poetic symbolism and so forth that is carried on by the successor gurus. One thing we need to keep in mind is that poetry is not for poetry's sake in this context. It has a philosophical understanding, a philosophical base. It has ethical implications. That's the whole point. How to become moral, how to become ethically cleansed, how to cultivate the best of humanity, how to cultivate relationship with fellow beings and with the cosmos at large. So the ethical note, the ethical strand is very crucial, and it is aesthetic. And that's where reception comes in. It's the beauty, the power of his alliteration, of his assonance, consonants, the rhythms, the meters that come and kind of strike right in our hearts. And that's how the congregations are created. That's how his message, his vision, his history becomes known, goes through a wider audience. So I want us to keep the mind, it's not poetry for poetry's sake, and it's nothing, kind of secular. The secular and the sacred are coming together. So basically, that's the paradox where the opposites come. We have these binaries, the sacred versus the secular, the transcendent versus the material, this versus the other world. And these kind of binaries are totally subverted, totally impended, totally dissolved in the message and poetry of the Sikh gurus. So that's kind of the poetics. The starting point, of course, is Guru Nanak, kind of his whole sublime verse, how that becomes kind of very physically and sensuously expressed in the poetry. And that's how it hits us as readers and as listeners in the audience. So Guru Tegh Bahadur's paradox. One is the total unicity of the divine one. There's only one, Eko, Eko, Eko. And that becomes the moral compass for the humans, how to interact with one another by recognizing that one. So the whole message, whole poetic message is to recognize that one, which is very much inherent within us. And that one has many names. In Guru Tegh Bahadur's verse, it is Ram, Hari, Gobind, Gosai, Prabh, Murari, Brahma, so forth. And yet this one is is present, is available, is accessible in a myriad forms. So that paradox of the one in the plurality, unicity in multiplicity, is very much the keynote of his oeuvre, of his whole works. As he says, this is from Rag Vairagar, Nana Roop Tare Bahurangi Sabte Rahe Niara. Nana Roop, many forms. Tare Bahurangi, the multicolored one, has all these, Sabte Rahe Nirala. And yet that one remains unique, kind of remains apart, kind of remains transcendent. So this kind of the unity of the two, this paradox, which Mircea Eliade spoke about its significance in many ways for religious language. How do we express the divine? Paradox becomes a very significant form, and we have that in very well, beautifully expressed in Guru Tegh Bahadur's verse. And when we think about it, what is the paradox doing? It's creating wonder. Wonder is philosophy. That's what Plato said. Philosophy begins in wonder, a view which was then echoed by Aristotle. It was their wonder, astonishment that first led men to philosophize and still leads them on. So for their philosophical thinking, the paradoxical expressions are very, very crucial. And as we remember, Guru Nanak himself said, Vismad Roop, Vismad Rang, Vismad Tarti, Vismad Khani. So the whole mood of wonder, of joy, this kind of wondrous, ecstatic mood, it comes with Guru Nanak on the Sikh horizon and is carried through by the gurus. And we see that, we really experience it in Guru Tegh Bahadur's poetry. So his poetry is very rich. It's really a treasure house. There are lots of metaphors. There's a lot of, what should I say, allusions to, to different Hindu myths, to the larger Indic world, the Vedas, to Draupadi, to the Mahabharata, always with empathy. There is the Ajamal protagonist, there is Ganika, the prostitute, all these people, all these characters, they were very, very much in tune with the world, with the larger Indic horizon, the literary, mythological, historical context, and those come into play in his poetry as well. But what I want to focus on today, which I find is very kind of the leitmotif of Guru Tegh Bahadur's poetry, is simile. S-I-M-I-L-E, Jaise, as, like so-and-so. So Guru Tegh Bahadur uses it quite a lot in his compositions. And somehow or the other, simile has lost its, what should I say, poetic richness. Modern scholars kind of view it on a lower tier than metaphor, because metaphor creates these comparisons, but metaphor is kind of implicit comparisons. So it seems to be more complex and more profound than simile. I want to argue against that. For me, Guru Tegh Bahadur kind of shows the power, the beauty, the profundity and richness of similes. And I will mention the key simile, I think, is, and we know the simile, the Hindi word for it is upama, and it is a part of alankar. Alankar is ornamentation and so forth. But when we look at Guru Tegh Bahadur's artwork, yes, it's alankar, simile is alankar, but it has nothing artificial. The way he uses it is so beautiful and so simple and so organic that it just becomes a part of his verse and gives it a certain kind of rhythm and melody. So and these are not just simplistic everyday similes that he uses. He creates associations. He creates connections in our mind. So we view things in new and different and fresh ways. The familiar becomes unfamiliar and the unfamiliar becomes so familiar. So that's kind of the genius, the way he does it. And these are very creative, very imaginative. These are not just everyday simple things. So the one which I think runs across, which is really kind of the key simile in Guru Tegh Bahadur's verse is Uhap mad jio baas basat hai, mukkar mahe jaise chai, तैसे ही हर बसे निरंतर कटही खोजो पाई. Uhap mad jio baas bast hai, like fragrance dwells in the flower, like fragrance, scent in the flower, like reflection in the mirror. Taise hi har bas se. Taise, just like that, the divine one, the transcendent one, the infinite one, the creator, preserver, destroyer, the reality of everything, base nirantar kathi, dwells nirantar, without any differentiation, equally in the heart. Khojo pai, discover it, brothers and sisters, discover it. So what he's doing is to discover something that permeates everywhere and is in our heart, it's in ourselves, in our bodies, but we don't know that. So to find, to discover, so the whole philosophical quest is to recognize, to discover. So human beings are given the responsibility to do that. There's nothing, no faith in something. It's not a belief system that he's giving us, but through these beautiful analogies, bringing that one, making us cognizant of that one within us to recognize it. And then it's repeated in Rag Sorat. So tum hi mein base nirantar nanak darpan nyai. The same image of the mirror. that just as that the reflection exists in the mirror, that's how the one dwells in us. What beautiful images, what beautiful similes that he's creating, the mirror and the reflection, the flower and the perfume, and the infinite one within us. Jaha Pitar jo Ram bast hai, jo Pitar, whatever is external, that is within us, recognize that. So everything is within. That's the main, what is coming through this analogy, through the simile. So for him, everything, whatever we, the praise, the urgency that he provides us. So life is short. So what I want to say is that sometimes his verses sound very pessimistic and so forth, but these are not, because the basic thing is the divine one, it's empowering us, it's within us. And he's giving us the urgency to recognize it, because we are totally oblivious of it. So many similes are used to show us the transiency of life. It's very short. So temporality is very important. Time, every instant is clicking by, minute is going. And here we are totally oblivious. The life is short. So his similes are very, very powerful, very sharp, and give a real, what should I say, real edge to his message. So in Rag Tilang, he says, Chetana hai to chetale, nis din mein prani, chin chin aud bihat hai, foote kat jo pani. So night and day, remember, Chetana hai to chetale, remember night and day. Why? Chin chin, moment by moment, second by second. Life is leaking away like water from a cracked vessel. And so life is like a, all this is like a bubble on a water, like a night's dream. Supne jo, baru ki peet, like a wall of sand. So all of these, it's like this world is like a hill of smoke. And then another very, which is repeated over and over. It's like a cloud's shadow. In Rag Gauri, it comes out. In Rag Sarang again. So like a shadow, cloud's shadow, this whole thing, this world is like that. It's going to disappear very quickly. So making us aware all the time, and sometimes very, very powerful, concrete imagery. And jagaleo re man na, jagaleo kaha gafal soya, wake up my mind. Why are you so obliviously asleep? Jo chuto tab dete dar agan mein deen. And here he's making us aware of the crematorial fire. What could be more concrete than that? The fire that the body will be eventually put into. Remember that. He's showing us that through his analogies. So all these are coming one after the other, very sharply, very concretely. But again, this is to make one fearless. That's how he depicted in his own life. His life embodied that fearlessness, that courage. And here I'm reminded of Heidegger, the existential philosopher, the German philosopher, for whom life is lived authentically only by recognizing death, Dasein. The person who authentically lives recognizes death. Otherwise, it's a very inauthentic existence. So inauthentically, one is oblivious. Dying is not an event. It is a phenomena to be understood existentially, and it is to be understood in a distinctive sense. This is what Heidegger says in Being and Time, section 46 to 52. So the inauthentic evade life every day, but by anticipation, one becomes free for one's own death. So Heidegger's inauthentic existence is vividly conveyed by Guru Tegh Bahadur. Jaise pahan jal mein rakhyo, paide nahi teh pani. So what is going on? Like a stone put in the water, nothing happens to it. There's no water that penetrates it. So that's kind of the inauthentic existence. And there he brings up like a dog, its tail never bends, it's curled up. And so is the mind. We are oblivious. Nothing gets into our mind. Just like water doesn't get into the stone, our minds are clueless about the divine one. So, one after the other, these similes are coming, pouring in to make us aware, to wake up. And by the way, I want to make a note of it. Guru Tegh Bahadur is not at all anti-animals. In fact, dog's devotion is very much lauded. The dog's devotion to the master's house won't leave it. He praises the dog. He praises the fish. We heard that in the Kirtan, the opening Shalok, like fish loves water, may we love the divine one. So it's very, very important, the cosmos at large, because everybody is endowed with that divine one. So I think I'm given 25 minutes and my time is coming to an end, so I better go fast. Anyway, I just want to emphasize that his similes are really to be put in such a way that we practice them, that something is instilled in us. And as he says, Sarv taram mano teh kiye jiv prabh kirti gai. So all taram, all kind of morality, all kind of ethics is practiced. Kaho nanak soi nur gurua, jo prabh ke gun gaave. So all morality, ethics is practiced when the divine one is praised. Jai prabh kirti gai, when the Prabhu's kirti, praise, is recited. So, and anybody can be great by singing the divine praise. Jiba gun gobind pajo karana suno haranam. Jiba, the tongue, recite the praise of the divine one. Ears hear the praise of the divine one. So so the body is very important. So in a way, Guru Tegh Bahadur's theophilia, the love for God, translates into somatophilia. I'm so accustomed to the phobia of the body that he kind of reverses that, because this is the body. This is how we recognize the divine one, how we become aware of the divine one, by singing. The tongue sings, the ears hear, we feel. And that theophilia translates into somatophilia, love for the body, and biophilia at large, love for life on earth with all biotic or abiotic beings. So it's a very, very, very positive message that comes across. And why the importance of praise? Let's think about it. What does praise do? Singing praise, because that's the only thing he tells us to do. There's no other, do's and don'ts given to us. Singing, appreciating the divine one, that sense of insularity, that individuality, that ego, that me, I, with all its kam, krodh, lobh, moh, ankar, with all these kind of toxic emotional and psychological poisons, dissolves, and the one becomes available. We get the space. Unless there's emotional space to accept the one, we cannot. So these, by singing and reciting, by praising, whenever we praise, the self dissolves and the other comes in. And that's the method, that's the technique, that's the aesthetic aspect of Guru Tegh Bahadur's poetry, his teaching. And I want us to recognize that he really joins the individual with the divine one. We may hear things, oh, the individual may be this, but the ultimate aspect, the beauty of Guru Tegh Bahadur's poetry, his message, his vision is there is no difference between the individual and the divine one. Jo prani nis din pajay, roop ram tin jaan. Jo prani din nis din pajay. The person who praises night and day, roop ram teh jaan. Know that person as the roop, as the form, as the image of the divine one. Look at the identity he's establishing. And then in the same way, Harjan har antar nahi, Harjan har antar nahi. There's no difference between the person who belongs to the divine one and the divine one. Nanak sachi man, know that. But the irony of ironies is that the master of all similes has no simile for divine name. Ram naam urme gayo, jaake sam nahi koe. Nothing comes close to embracing the divine one in our heart. Jai Simrat Sankat Mite, Daras Tuharo Hoye. Only by reciting the divine name, by praising the divine name, by remembering the divine one, our troubles disappear. We see you. Daras tuharo hoy, daras tuhar. We see you. So when we see that one, the infinite one, the transcendent one, that ego dissolves. There is a relational quality that is established. So, between you, the divine one, and the self. So this kind of relational, the intimacy is very, very important to Guru Tegh Bahadur. And I think through his similes and through his poetic genius and art, he accomplishes it. So his whole, there's something contagious about his poetry. There's something infectious about it. It does something to us, the hearer, the listener, the reader. And the entire corpus is suffused with the love of the divine one. That theophilia flows into biophilia, this world whose reality we are oblivious of, for fellow beings, for the sangat, for the body, for the individual body, where it inheres, dwells. The ideal person lives without divisions, categories, and hegemonies. The oneness, when one practices, when one sees the one, gold and clay are the same. Pleasure and pain are the same. They are fearless. They live a life of freedom. Moksha is not in the other world, but right here, where we are free from our narrow-walled dualistic egos. Guru Tegh Bahadur's timeless verse is most relevant to our divided and dangerously divided global world. Love is the message, not hatred. Life is short. Liberation is here and now, and we must take up action. The Guru made the supreme sacrifice for human equality, liberty, and dignity. Our global society needs to hear his empowering poetry. It is indeed a priceless treasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singh, for your very inspirational and very thoughtful talk on Guru Tegh Bahadur's use of simile and poetics in his Bani. Without further ado, we'll move on to our next speaker, Dr. Harjeet Singh Grewal. His work is entitled Salok Mahalla Nova, Reflections on Mental Health and COVID-19. Dr. Grewal teaches Sikhism and religious philosophy courses in the Department of Classics and Religion at the University of Calgary. He completed his dissertation titled Janam Sakhi, Retracing Networks of Interpretation at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in 2017. His research interests include Sikh philosophy, diaspora, and literature. So without further ado, Dr. Grewal.
Thanks, Gurbeer, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure we don't have another audio malfunction as we go forward. So quick note, if you do hear any stomping or loud voices, those are my children. They're probably just upstairs making a lot of noise, so I apologize for that in advance if that comes through on the microphone. I want to quickly thank Professor Pashora Singh and his team, Gurbeer, Tegh Bahadur specifically, as well as Adam, for organizing this conference for the 400th birth anniversary of Prakash Gurupurv of Shri Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib. I'm really happy that we had the opportunity to have talks side by side with Nikki and I, so I appreciate the schedule readjustment, although it would have been an honor to speak with beside Pashora Singh also. I just think that it'll be nice to talk about literature side by side with Nikki here. The team at Riverside have for long set the standard for hospitality at Sikh Studies conferences, and for that I'm grateful. I've spent many years following the discursive developments that began with the celebrations of Guru Nanak's 500th Gurpurab, studying the Janam Sakhis. So I'm honored and fortunate to not only be alive, but to participate in today's discussion, as well as earlier ones which happened surrounding the 550th Gurpurab of Guru Nanak in 2019. Indeed, these two Gurpurabs are historic occasions, and they often do coincide with scholarly discussions. And coincidentally, they mark, for me, a radical change or shift in social habits across many societies, much of the globe, over the last 2 years, as the pandemic limitations on how we socialize and understand ourselves as mortal beings have entered almost every aspect of our lives. Before going any further, I wanted to acknowledge that today, while this meeting is taking place virtually, many of us are doing so on contested lands where the rights of many who seek to exist harmoniously with land, creation, and societies are denied their basic rights. Riverside is located on the traditional lands of the Kawiya, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano people and ancestors. I'm speaking to you from Edmonton, Alberta. Yay, Edmonton, which is situated on Treaty 6 territory and also part of the homeland of Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. As a resident of the Millwoods community here in Edmonton, specifically, I reside on lands that were stolen from the Papachase tribe through forceful, deceptive, and destructive process occurring after the establishment of Treaty Number 6. And I also happen to work at the University of Calgary, which is on traditional lands of the people of the Treaty 7 region. Lastly, as a child of Punjabi Sikh migrants, I also wanted to acknowledge and recognize that these processes of force, deceit, and destruction remain operative across much of northwestern regions of South Asia and are actually being played out right now as we speak, where sovereign land claims and basic citizenry rights of people like Kashmiris, Pashtuns, Sindhis, and Sikhs, to name but a few, are systematically and daily denied. So I have a complicated relationship with my situation and my positionality in terms of what I'm going to be talking about. Indeed, land and inaccessibility issues are amongst the many problems that have been accentuated during the pandemic and have impacted people's mental health. My paper today takes the form of a preliminary reflection on or meditation of some of the difficulties with mental health, my own to start with the onset of COVID-19 and my routinization of listening to the Shaloks of Shri Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib, which are found in the last portions of the Shri Guru Granth Sahib. I will be referring to this section as Shalok Mahalla Noma throughout the talk, in part to recognize the palatial and central position of Gurbani, as can be seen expressed in Ang 627, Turki Bani Ai, in Sagli Chint Mitai from Mahalla Panjama, and the relationship between embodied gurus and Gurbani, such as found in Japji Sahib's 19th 40, Jin e likhe tis sir nae, jiva formaye, tiva tiva paye. In recognizing this, I have already started talking about the relationship between language, conceptualization, and mental health, where the arrival of Bani and having it written upon one's mind or man is connected with acting through a self-othering that erases anxieties. I begin my paper by providing a brief definition of mental health in order to connect to the intellectual resources within the Sikh tradition, foremost of which is the Shri Guru Granth Sahib. Next, I discuss how I began to regularly engage in Nam Simran through reciting Shalok Mahalla Noma, the entirety of the Shaloks, and then turn to provide a structural apparatus within which to read Shalok Mahalla Noma through the lens of mental health. Lastly, or while doing this, I will briefly discuss a relationship between, all too briefly, the relationship between Gurbani and mental health, using again Shalok Mahalla Noma as the place to ground my considerations. So mental health has become pervasive in today's parlance, so much so that many, including myself, may not often pause to think about what it actually means. The World Health Organization has defined mental health in the following way, and I quote, mental health is the foundation for the well-being and effective functioning of individuals. It is more than the absence of a mental disorder. It is the ability to think, learn, and understand one's emotions and the reactions of others. Mental health is a state of balance, both within and with the environment. Physical, psychological, social, cultural, spiritual, and other interrelated factors participate in producing this balance. There are inseparable links between mental and physical health, end quote. This definition is beneficial in scope and also revelatory in that it acknowledges that mental health is something that pertains to science, medicine, public health, and social work, but also that it extends beyond this into the social, cultural, and religious sphere dealt with in social sciences and humanities more specifically. Mental health, one might argue, is the epitome of multidisciplinarity. We see discussions of mental health in popular culture, It is a way to contextualize individual lived experience and often forms an aspect of interpersonal relationships. Discussion about mental health is not uncommon in the media and often acts as a semi-regular topic of discussion during news broadcasts, radio talk shows, podcasts, and numerous other virtual online forums. In some way, it is replaced or expanded into the social space occupied by popular psychology. Mental health is a topic of importance in Sikh diasporas where settler colonial realities as ethnic minorities create a fugitive setting within which to discuss the intergenerational impact of moments that are formative for modern Sikh habitus that gets minted during the 20th century. Such as moments like Guru Ka Bagh Morcha in the 1920s, the partition of Punjab in 1947, and the Punjabi Suba movement, which kind of follows on the heels of that. And lastly, the decades-long movement of self-determination, anecdotally referred to as 1984. Successive waves of migration are occurring throughout this century and also inform the Sikh diasporic imaginary. The modern Sikh habitus is recognized by some as the attainment of a normative modern or so-called secular identity by some. For others, it is a staging grounds for resistance or sangharsh against forms of ontological colonization. Recognizing both perspectives, I suggest that the ways Sikhs inhabit the 21st century is contested. And moreover, that discussions of mental health are often staged within these sites of contestation. And further to this, that these sites of contestation have increased and become more apparent with the conditions that the pandemic has brought forth. The nexus for issues pertaining to mental health, intergenerational trauma, and a host of correlated issues of insecurity, therefore, are most often discussed within the nexus of history, memory, and forgetting. In other words, these conversations are often confined to the conditions of coloniality and its continuation in post-colonial Sikh realities, where Sikhs are minorities negotiating different degrees of recognition while struggling against their assimilation within the nation state's institutions. Discussions about mental health issues may at times include personalized retinues of practicing Sikhism as a form of mindfulness denuded of Gurmat's epistemology and its ontological consequences to create a relativistic and ambiguous quasi-Zen-like approach to meditation to increase an individual's ability to live within the world while accessing a range of emotions that are in the present. Prolonged engagement with and consideration of the Shri Guru Granth Sahib, not to mention the litany of other central Sikh texts that exist in the Sikh tradition, often escape these types of circumscription. Thus, for the purposes of my musings, I would suggest that the World Health Organization's definition is amenable to how Sikhs might practice Gursikhi, wherever this definition disrupts strictly objective forms of existentiality. My interest in questions of mental health vis-a-vis the global minoritized conditions that Sikhs live in has been enlivened by numerous conversations with undergraduate students while teaching religion and Sikh studies courses since I began with the University of Calgary. From 2017 until today, undergraduates with much higher emotional intelligence and empathy than I had been socialized to acknowledge and ask questions about mental health and intergenerational trauma based on my course framework, where we discuss aspects of Sikh textuality, especially and beginning with Shri Guru Granth Sahib. Many of these students share a complicated self-understanding with me as they are children of migrants to Canada and are increasingly aware of the complicated legacies of systematic oppression and resistance to what Sikhs face every day in the communities they live in. Moreover, many of these students empathically act from this complicated net of issues to reach out and learn about issues relating to multinational Indigenous groups, Black communities, as well as other ethnic minorities that live in their vicinity. They are interested in drawing upon their own cultural and religious resources to enhance the ability to address mental health issues and make meaningful cross-cultural connections. These conversations increased my awareness that a significant lacuna exists, however, in the ability to connect Sikh lived experience to mental health issues with the intellectual resources that are within the Sikh tradition. Foremost amongst that, again, is the Shri Guru Granth Sahib. Unbeknownst to me at the time, my conversation with students helped create a local initiative in Calgary called Punjabi Resilience and Empowerment in Mental Health, or PRAME, as a response to ongoing issues with forms of abuse, suicide that were plaguing Sikh youth and continue to do so in Alberta and across much of Canada. This led to my involvement with a workshop that was entitled Decolonizing the Mind, put on by PRAME on January 11th and 12th of 2020, just days after the announcement of the first or early COVID cases on January 9th. I can recall my wife and I discussing the potential fallout from this on the drive to Calgary, and how the discussion of a novel virus triggered much of my earlier molecular genetics training I had received in my previous life as a student of biology. So often in biology, they teach you that like this kind of new virus that would emerge would be kind of, signal or kind of apocalyptic in some ways. And the scientists often address this issue. And so it was kind of triggering some of that as I was thinking about what we're going to the PRAME conference. We returned to teaching courses after this event, although every week there was a slow tension building as more and more news about the virus was released. I remember watching my class attendance diminish slowly with each passing class, and eventually having a conversation with students about their concerns regarding being on campus, which was kind of revelatory about how nervous they were about continually having to come to campus and feeling kind of forced to do so. That's in contradiction to kind of what's been going on since closing. But by March, as the spring semester break loomed and preparations to transition to online teaching were in full swing, regrettably, I have not been able to be before students before that with the closing and lockdowns that have been ongoing since then. The mix of the abrupt transition to online teaching, the death of George Floyd, the beginning of the protests in Punjab in June, ongoing revelations about social injustice, including the death of Joyce Echwakwan, the Morcha in Delhi, and the unearthing of mass graves in the vicinity of residential schools here in Canada, made me overwhelmed and able to cope, to say the least. It was at this moment my mind began to turn to Guru Tegh Bahadur, whose life many Sikhs like myself were taught about in the familial and local Gurdwara context. This included learning that the Guru's life was marked by a fearless struggle against trauma, oppression, and injustice, which I believe Professor Pashora Singh will talk about. Guru Tegh Bahadur is emblematic of Shahidi and Qurbani in quite literal ways. He embodies Sahaj or equipoise and Anand or tranquility of mind, as they are expounded upon in the Shri Guru Granth Sahib. I was taught that Guru Tegh Bahadur's Shaloks exemplify these traits, and I started thinking about this, and I kind of gathered my remembrance of this learning, and I felt it kind of entering into my consciousness due to the duress I was desperately trying to suppress in order to continue trying to go about my daily responsibilities. It was following my routine of Nam Simran one day in April of 2020. I was thrown into recollection of a moment from my brief time at Bani Singh's Taksal in Amritsar, where I heard Guru Tegh Bahadur's Shaloks being performed in the traditional dialogic manner. And it's quite interesting to think about that. We're not going to talk about too much of that here, but I think some of the dialogic manner kind of marks some of the similes and metaphors and the kind of paradoxes through the switching of voices in this kind of dialogic manner that Nikki was talking about in her talk just before me. So those moments were absolutely captivating for me and provided me with a rarely experienced clarity and the desire to immerse myself fully in the Shri Guru Granth Sahib. The return of this moment that had haunted me since I left Punjab in 2013 led me to recite, and at other times during the day, listen to performances of the Shalok repeatedly, some of which we kind of heard just before our panel. The disruption of those early conversations about mental health with undergraduates by COVID-19, therefore, brought me to the Shaloks of Mahalla Noma so that I could deal with the mental health pressures I faced due to the social pandemic that COVID released. So what's the structure of the Shaloks? Shalok Mahalla Noma, they were added by Gurbeer Singh while preparing to create a new recension of the Ad Granth and replace it and make it the Guru of the Sikh Panth. So this was meant to replace the earlier iterations that existed, and there's problems associated with that, therefore requiring it to be replaced. The addition of the shloks was just one of several changes that Guru Gobind Singh Ji makes. Beyond recognizing this, I will not really discuss just too much further for purposes of time. Shlok Mahalla Noma is a series of 57 compositions that occur between Ang 1426 and Ang 1429 of the Shri Guru Granth Sahib. I argue that the shlok can be thought of, albeit somewhat tersely, as divided thematically and in a stadial manner, where the first 27 shloks describe performance of Nam Simran and the affect of Simran, wherein the requirements and importance of Simran are stated, the requirements of sacrifice are given, and lastly, what is attained through these sacrifices and the performance of Simran are discussed. The next section of shloks between 28 and 57 describe the world as illusory and false, while insisting that Simran enables release from this way of existing in the world. This is significant in the context of recognizing that the constant reference to an internal dialogue with the man enables us to connect these shloks to issues of mental health and may assist in unpacking how Nam Simran can be used to enhance positive mental health. So my thematic kind of division of this is somewhat facilitative of the discussion I want to have of mental health, and is not meant to be more eternal, quote unquote, than that. Shlok Mahalla Noma is bookended on either side by the shloks of Mahalla Panjma, written through Guru Arjan. These shloks comprise a larger section known as Shlok Varanke Vadik. Both the concluding or 22nd shlok by Mahalla Panjma that precedes Shlok Mahalla Noma and the shlok in the Mundavani section contain references to Sajjan, the sovereign truth that humans rely on for support. We read Sajjan Sacha Pat Sao, Sir Sahan De Sao, Jis Paas Baithya Soye, Sabna Da Vasao, and then in the next section, Tars Paya Mehramat Hoi Satguru Sajjan Milya, Nanak Naam Milay Tan Jiva, Tan Man Thiva Harya. So Mahalla Panjma describes sitting and resting within the presence of that sovereign truth in Shlok 22nd. And then in the Shlok from Mandavani describes the experience of torment or tars that enacts the compassion of that sovereign friend or sajjan to enable a meeting. The Shlok ends by stating that it is Nam wherein meeting occurs, and the experience transforms our being or honed. So tive has to do with honed or hona, so that we live harmoniously and tranquilly in the world of appearance. It reminds me of the promise given in the Ardas regarding recollection of Guru Tegh Bahadur, where it states, Tegh Bahadur simriye kar naunid ave tai, or that doing Simran on the shloks of Mahalla Noma helps accrue the treasures to that we may reside, or so that we may reside, in the presence of that sovereign being. I'd like to suggest that the experience of Simran as discussed enables us to shift in how we engage with the world. And this is a shift that occurs through the mind and body and makes those things no longer divided. So the use of paradoxes and simile that Nikki was talking about, I think, are significant in terms of enacting this transformation. And the writing is formative and helps enable that. Thus, the insertion of Mahalla Noma's shloks in between Mahalla Panjma's references about being in the presence of a friendly sovereign truth, I take as significant in contouring how we might read Shlok Mahalla Noma, in the context of questions about mental health. Shlok Mahalla Noma, I'll just spend a little bit of time here reading this, doing an analysis, a brief and terse analysis. So to turn to discussing these in relation to these shloks in relation to mental health, I would like to start with the 9th shlok, where we see the definition of Ram as a singular principle that gives dignity and welfare to all. We read, Sab sukh data Ram hai, dusar nahin koe, ho nanak sun re mana, Teh simrat gate hoy. This suggests that through Simran, one can attain that plane of being within one's mind. This is an important point that connects to the initial refrain, which begins the entire Shlok Mahalla Noma section. In the first two shloks, we read, and Nikki mentioned this as well, but Gun Gobind Gayo Nahi Janamakarat Keen, Kohuna Nikahar Pajamana, Jehebed Jalako Meen, Bikhian Syon Kahe Rachio, Nimak Na Hoe Udas, Kohuna Nik Paj Haramana, Parena Jamki Pas. Thus, the framework and importance for reciting or singing the praises of the Creator are seen to populate and give meaning to one's life. They provide a way to be resilient against depression or udasi and avoid the pangs of a worldly death. The Jamki Pas represents that part of it. What has struck me most is, however, in my recitations, is the latter half of the section from 27 to the 57th Shalok. I can recall feeling as though I'm being kind of struck by the Shabads themselves as I recite them. And reciting these passages repeatedly enhances that effect. This section includes the 51st and 52nd Shaloks, which talk about anxiety. So, Chinta taki kijiye, jo anhoni hoy, eho marg sansar ko, nanak thir nahi koy. Jo upajyo so bin sahay, paro aaj kai kaal, nanak har gun gaye le, chhad sagal janjal. These shloks speak to the impermanence of events, especially those events that were unexpected, unthinkable or impossible, unhoni hoy. They implore us to not feel anxious about such occurrences. It states that what is gained by singing praises through Nam takes one beyond time and lets the practitioner depart from the trappings of all such concerns. The illusoriness and falseness that pervade the world can be seen also in and expressed quite poignantly in Shlok 49 of this section. Jag rachna sab jhoot hai, jaan leo re meet, kah nanak thir na rahe, jion balu ke peet. So again, Nikki mentioned this as well, a reference to or the simile here. So Jagrachna, it's discussing the world and the knowledge of things associated with it are stated here to be temporary and providing false succor in the sense of the self as a final truth or permanent reality. A simile stated here with quote as or in the manner of or jion helps deepen our engagement with the first line. It states that worldly knowledge is as permanent as a wall made of sand. So it's contradictory again because it's not that permanent. However, we perceive it as permanent and operate on that, and it enhances our anxiety when impossible events occur, such as a pandemic. This enhances the affect that will enable the later kind of expressions in Shlok 51 I mentioned earlier, when the reciter expresses that there is no need to be anxious because of worldly affairs. Discussion on falseness also occurs early and expresses how the world of objects and our desire to acquire those objects in our lifetimes creates a sense of pride amongst those afflicted with duality of mind. The 41st Shlok expresses this in the following manner. Chuthe maan kaha karai, jag supne jion jaan, inme kach tero nahi, nanak keho bakhan. So the world of material is to be thought of as a dream state, giving rise to a superfluous and deceptive sense of pride in acquisition of material objects. In a capitalistic world that has taken the mode of production and replication of materiality to extremes, I conjecture that recognizing the deleterious impacts of how COVID disrupts our desire to acquire material objects is significant to explore alongside thinking about how practices like Nam Simran move practitioners beyond such limits. The practitioner here recites and at the same time tells one's mind or man that none of these objects are actually yours. I suggest this works, in a manner to perhaps cognitively rewire our neural networking towards the perpetual acquisition and reroute that by enacting a kind of destruction of the objector world itself within the perceptive capacities of the mind. Furthermore, this process may enable a way to learn different types of ethical and moral action. Nikki again mentioned some of that, and the likes of which I think are signaled and given in tradition through the Sakhis related to the 10 Sikh Gurus, the Shaheeds, etc. So I think I'll end it there and just kind of open it up for discussion. I do have a little bit more, but I want to kind of have a conversation, and I'd like to kind of close there and invite everyone to participate with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grewal, on your talk on Salok melanoma and its implications in daily life and mental health, especially in the light of COVID. I think it's really relevant, given that most of us here, or a lot of us here, are instructors, do teach university students, either as TAs or professors. So thank you a lot for your talk. I think we can just dive on the deep end. Let's get Dr. Nikki to turn on her camera as well so that we can hop into the Q&A. But yeah, we'll start straight at the top. So Rupinder Barad asks for Nikki Singh ji, excellent lecture as always. You talk about the Guru writing great similes and metaphors. Do you think he made a deliberate pun on the word Gobind and his son Guru Gobind Rai when he wrote Naam Raheo Sadhu Raheo Guru Gobind? And then was there a social or political message there? So Dr. Singh, the stage is yours.
If I'm not wrong, first of all, I want to thank Harjeet for his excellent presentation. And this is what I mean, like how Guru Tegh Bahadur's poetry becomes so meaningful and so applicable to our lives here and now. That's really, really important. And you brought it up really beautifully. Thank you, Harjeet. Now to Dr. Rupinder Bar's question. I'm not a historian. If I'm not wrong, Peshawar Singh talks about it in his article about the word Gobind Singh. All I can say is that Gobind is used several times by Guru Tegh Bahadur, and amongst the many names for the Divine One. Ram is there. I mentioned 7 or 8 names that he uses. So I have not looked at it from a historical perspective. From that perspective, I leave it to the historians, Harjeet and Peshawar and others. I look at from the more poetic side, and Gobind, of course, it could be contextualized. Of course, poetry is open. It's open to hermeneutics. It's what we want to do. And we want to use, just as Harjeet used the lens to interpret it from a contemporary perspective, we can certainly do it. There may be, after all, that was his son. He was getting ready to go and, offer himself. So it's quite possible, but I cannot say for certainty because that's not my area.
Would anybody else like to comment on that, or should we move on?
Maybe Peshawar Singh or...
Dr. Singh just turned on his camera, so let's see, Dr. Singh.
Because he has talked about it.
Well, Guru Tegh Bahadur uses in both senses. Raheo Guru Gobind, it is a very positive, optimistic legacy that he's leaving before he's encountering the Mughal authorities in New Delhi, in Delhi at that time. So also, because he had experienced, there were a number of contenders to the office of Guru when Guru Tegh Bahadur had to, fight those forces. And he wanted to make absolutely sure that Guru Gobind Singh, Gobind Rai, is the Guru, and Gobind is also God, and God, divine power, resides in Guru Gobind Singh. So I'll be speaking about this, in my talk as well. But I think both senses are there.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Singh, for your elaboration. Okay, moving on to the next question. So this is from Dr. Manpreet Kaur Singh. Thank you, Dr. Nikki Pua, for bringing Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji's similes to life. Understanding these metaphors are critical for reconciling the ironies and paradoxes of existence. Do you think that the ultimate focus of love and divisiveness is an example of a feminine principle in Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji's Bani?
You know, I mean, he mentions my so many times in his Bani, so that vocative is there, very much so. It appears at least 10, 12 times, you know, across his Bani. So I interpret it from my feminist lenses, of course, but then again, what do we mean by feminist? You know, it's really, these gurus are talking about equality, you know, to be treated to everybody, it's human dignity. And of course, they have that sensitivity. They are open to male, female, Hindu, Muslim. They're making no, you know, are they doing it consciously feminist? I'm not sure. But certainly that spirit of inclusivity, that spirit of embracing everybody, that's certainly a part. And if we can hear the tone, the feminist tone, I did not look at it from that perspective. Of course, I would see again and again doing a feminist, wearing that feminist lens and doing a feminist hermeneutics. But there's just so much they offer to humanity, and we can, you know, we can see it from various angles. I mean, this poetry is so dynamic, and it's really making these connections, associations, and it's a very cognitive process. You know, we kind of think, oh, poetry, oh, this is just art and so forth. You know, these are creating synaptic connections, bringing two different worlds together, two different dimensions together. So the male and the female are coming together for sure, for sure, for sure. You know, when he's a male guru is addressing Meri Mai, how to do this, what am I, you know, so it's a real coming from the depths of himself, the way he's addressing, certainly. So yes, my answer is yes, ultimately, although I didn't quite think about it earlier. Thank you for bringing it up.
Okay, thank you so much. Next question we have is from Satnam Kaur. Harjeet, sir, please elaborate the mental condition of a son or daughter of a migrant Punjabi person. Do they easily follow their parents' religion, Sikhism, or is it like a tug of war between Sikhism and other religions?
So that's an interesting question. I think I mean, first and foremost, I think there needs to be a lot more research in terms of just going back to what even my colleague Jasjeet Singh mentioned earlier. You know, kind of a plug for this is that, you know, there needs to be a lot more research in these places to kind of have a better idea. Preliminarily, I would actually think that you know, the issues that I'm talking about specifically in relation to the context of diasporicity here in the paper and the relation to mental health pertains to kind of the whole constellation of questions that people inherit and the issues that kind of come with not being able to have a grounding in a tradition. I would say tradition goes beyond religion, and kind of the, you know, some of what even Professor Nikky-Guninder Singh was mentioning in terms of, you know, the constellation of kind of Indic civilizational references that are within our texts, as well as other traditions and other religious traditions that exist therein, make it extremely difficult in the context of diasporic life, where there is often not much time to spend with parents, especially given that, you know, a lot of, while on one side people celebrate Sikh diasporicity, the realities of that are often murkier and darker than those kind of celebrations reveal, where parents are working multiple jobs, you know, substance abuse, other types of abuse, health issues arise because of those jobs. There's not a lot of connection. And so there's a kind of inheritance of other things that comes through. And people misunderstand sometimes what their religion is about, because they're kind of filling in the gaps, as Jasjeet Singh was saying even earlier, through online interactions, right? So rather, where before, and you know, again, Professor Nikky-Guninder Singh benefited from this, is having direct personal interactions with masters who would teach you these things. Now this is happening in kind of virtual space. So a lot of things can kind of go haywire in that. Also then the context within which I was talking about, you know, suicides, depressions, even further substance abuse amongst youth are aspects that students are talking about in terms of intergenerational trauma. that are connected to those kind of lingering impacts of the violence and the continual oppression of Sikh existentiality, Sikh lives, a Sikh being that are occurring in South Asia, and which really are just different, refracted differently in other minority spaces. So I think there's something a lot more complicated there that needs to be discussed and talked about that goes much beyond simply talking about a threat from one religion or another. I hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you so much, Harjeet, for that answer. Moving on, this question is again from Dr. Manpreet Kaur Singh. Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji lived during the Enlightenment when moral attitudes towards the mentally ill began to reform from the more primitive need to isolate in asylums towards viewing mental illness as requiring compassionate and collaborative treatment to facilitate rehabilitation. I wonder if this historical context aligns with Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji's focus to empower the mind and to heal itself. As a psychiatrist myself, focusing now on helping college students flourish, do you have suggestions on how Guru Sahib's message can be popularized?
Thank you for the question, Manpreet Singh Ji. So I'm actually really interested in this as well at this moment. I think there's other, kind of similarly minded scholars right now who are working along this. I think it's really important to make this relevant. And again, this is part of what I was speaking about with the kind of loss. I think often students are filling in, bits of data that they can cull from virtual spaces with kind of lived experience and real deep connection and conversations about Gurbani and other texts that are connected therein and understood as Bani. So I think that one of the ways to kind of popularize this message is, part of what I think is to make this apparent in research and to talk about it and try to discuss and connect the kind of conceptuality we receive in our everyday lives here and to challenge that conceptuality as well through deeper readings of what kind of are the ways to look at and engage and think about Gurbani, both in terms of literature from a literary perspective, through critical theory, and as well as through philosophy. And then I think from there, having conversations and developing research within social sciences and humanities, psychological ones specifically, as well as sociological or social work, I think can really kind of enhance this and get beyond kind of that kind of quasi-Zen type of meditative trance we're supposed to go into to kind of be at peace or be in the present. And a lot of things where I think there's dissonance with the textual apparatus that we receive and those kind of broader understandings that have been popularized through Western engagements with Indic as well as Asian forms of religiosity through the latter half of the 20th century. So I think one of the ways to popularize this, again, is to make it interesting and then to have it kind of filtered down through research into everyday applications.
Can I just add here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
I really want it to be publicized more. I don't know what to do because the compositions, the poetry is really, really significant. And I think I want us to kind of think together collectively, everybody, how can we make the poetry of the gurus available to a wider audience in classrooms and so forth, and in other places and I think we need simple translations. And if we make it into poetry, I'm not saying, poetry is universal. It's like available for everybody. And if we can have them in bookstores and so forth, it just would be so nice where people can pick up and read Guru Tegh Bahadur, Guru Arjan, Guru Nanak. It just would be so important. I just feel there's just such a treasure and it's not available to the world. It's we Sikhs read it, we recite it, we do kirtan, we hear it in the gurdwaras. I just got a lovely note from my very dear colleague, friend, Pogal at Wellesley College, where she does music. And she's so touched by Guru Tegh Bahadur's shloks and so forth, kirtan taking place in Kafi Tilang. But how does the everyday person? I want to make it available to my students. So I just want to put in a little pitch for my book, for my translation, where I did many years ago. I translated the couplets, the Shaloks of Guru Tegh Bahadur in the hymns of the Sikh Gurus. That was Nitnem Bani. It's very simple. It has the Japji Sahib, it has Lama, it has, Rehras, Shabd Hazare, Sukhmani Saab, so basically our Nitnem, Guru Gobind Singh's Jap, Chaupai, etc. So it's a very simple one. And I'm really, none of my Sikh friends community knows about it. And I have students who read it and find this poetry very, very empowering. And I want to thank again, is this our conclusion, or what, do we have another minute or two, Gurbeer?
We have 4 minutes. There are a few other questions, but I'll leave you guys.
And I want to give me the last word. I want to thank you all. Thank you.
If I can just jump in too, I think it is important to recognize contributions of scholars like Nikki, who are working to translate these things. And actually, the really cool thing, and I appreciate this a lot with what you're doing, Professor Singh, is that the bringing of these things into popular press, I think, is really important, and hopefully, that gives greater accessibility for people who are wanting to look at this. And I think part of what I was speaking about, you're doing there is, there needs to be greater attention to translation and translatability. Even if it's kind of interesting if you think, many of us are scholars here. If you look at what kind of standard linguistic transliteration looks like, and you look at any translation or transliteration of Gurbani online, there's a difference there, and so there's just these disjuncts, and I think there's again, greater coordination is needed, greater connection between people who want to do things and scholars as well, and then encouraging people to know what is available for them rather than just what's available online, or even moving some of these things into that online space might be viable options as well to kind of help situate these things in broader contexts.
Yeah, thank you, Harjeet. I guess to wrap it up, thank you both for your presentations and your elaboration on Q&A. We do have a few more questions in the Q&A box. I'll leave you guys on here during the break so the both of you can answer them directly into the typing. I think I did have an idea, or something that came to mind. I think one of the things that comes to popular press is this idea of secular and non-secular when it comes to popular press. If we look at right now, Rumi is really popular, and you look at Rumi's translation, they've been secularized to the extent where his original work is not even recognizable, and that's what's selling. So it needs to, I think we have to grapple first with the idea of, if something's automatically deemed as religious, it's not, it's hard, it's very difficult to try and make it popular, because people automatically assume, especially because the climate in the West right now, that as soon as something is associated with a major world religion, it's biased. It's you can't read it without any kind of biased lens, which is why, again, Rumi is selling so much, because you remove Allah, you remove Islam, and you just make these more fairy tale type of translations, which essentially ends up ruining Rumi's initial message. Dr. Singh.
Gurbeer, here I differ from you, dear. If we do, I don't know about Rumi, but if we do Guru Granth Sahib and we do it word by word, it can be beautifully translated and it can be available to the problem is what Harjeet said earlier, because the way we translate makes it, all these lords and gods and so forth are not there. It's one. Tohe, the sentence I read to you, Tohe, Tera, it's so direct. But we give those connotations and we make that other world and we impose something which is not there in the original. So we translators are doing something erroneous. We are putting, whereas the gurus made it so simple and beautiful.
Yeah.
They're connecting with us. They're relating with us as an intimacy with the divine one. It's not that creator out there. This is the creator here. Every little bit palpitates with the divine one. So I think there is something fundamentally wrong with our translations. That's the message we are giving. And there's an aberration. It's a beautiful, simple, beautiful. I really mean it. It's poetic. There's no such thing as sacred or secular. it is poetry. It's beautiful.
Of course.
Guru's poetry, sublime poetry, divine poetry that is to be enjoyed aesthetically, with your bodies, with your senses. Kanni, akhi, jeeb, these are very material, and we think of body as bad, these binaries that we create. So there's something wrong with our own minds. And it's because what the scholars and the elites and the interpreters and the hermeneutics and exegetes have been doing it. And we need to get away from that.
Yeah, I just want to add there real quick. I think that, and I want to make sure that Nikki, you get the last word too. So, Gurbeer, let's just be conscious of that, so that she's asked for that. So let's,
of course.
But I just want to quickly say, I just want to, what you were saying about I on purpose, in the paper, I was self-consciously put that definition of Ram in there. Sab sukh data Ram hai, dusar na hin koi, right? So, so I think that that's important to see, because Qurbani is giving us the definitions. So when we look elsewhere, first and foremost, if we're replacing it with the Lord, or we're replacing it with characters from epics and things like that from the broader Indic, but those references are there, of course. But we need to be more careful about how we're translating those. Generalizing to the Lord doesn't help, and doing it the other way to make it look like everything is referring to epics and other types of literature also doesn't convey everything. So there needs to be a lot more care in how these things are translated.
And I think, I just want to say that Bhagat Kabir makes that difference. There's one Ram, the historical, the epic Ram, and then there's Ram for the divine word. I mean, these were the words that were used. Anyway, my last word is, I had translated that years ago, Guru Tegh Bahadur's Shaloks. And I really have not presented an academic paper on it. So I just want to thank Dr. Pashora Singh and this conference, one, to celebrate and give me the occasion of really thinking, and it's beautiful poetry. And I was really on cloud 9 the last weekend. So thank you very much. And Harjeet, listening to Harjeet really made it, wow, this is applicable. This is something for us now. So thank you all. And thank you, Dr. Pashora Singh, again for doing this conference, hosting this. It's really valuable.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Singh.